All right. Steve Wood, recovered alcoholic. Welcome to the Great Reality. Um, this is our third group so far, and we'll probably still won't get in the big book tonight, but we're going to do some cool stuff. And you know, just to reiterate, last 2 weeks we did cover a lot of history, different groups, groups that tried recovery, attempted recovery, if you even want to call it recovery, but lots of them that we saw their solution was abstinence, or one was moderation, one even had fellowship, but none of them had a recovery plan. Um,
Mm,
then um, we got into the 20s, and it's a dark time in the history of the United States. I mean, drug addiction is all time high, alcoholism is all time high, and prohibition is going on, and drugs are illegal, right? Inebriate asylums are big, very they just got called inhumane by the 1920s, but a lot of those guys were put in regular asylums. So we started seeing groups come up that were a little bit deeper in addiction, and started using people that were addicts and alcoholics. Like the Emmanuel movement used addicts and alcoholics as lay therapists, and but their solution was spiritual, and they had no recovery plan. But then you had the Oxford group, who wasn't a recovery group, but I think everyone's in recovery, right? Somehow or another, right? But their solution was God, and they had a 5-step program. And then the Oxford group, let me make Rob a co-host because I hear background music and kicking. Sorry, everybody. Um, and I mean, Carl Jung had spiritual experience as a solution, and but couldn't produce a recovery plan for that worked on every alcoholic. And um, but then Alcoholics Anonymous spiritual experience was their solution, and recovery plan 12 steps. So eventually 12 steps. So we discussed last week the 5 procedures of the Oxford group, and that is surrender our past, present, and to God's keeping and direction, sharing our sins with another life given to God, restitution to all those we wronged directly, indirectly, listening to God's guidance and carrying it out. So we keep the conversion experience real. They carry the Oxford message to salvation to others. So Roland Hazard left Carl Jung, and he goes and works with this guy after Jung tells him, you need to have a vital spiritual experience. He works with this guy named Courtney Baylor. Courtney Baylor was a very vital person. The history of Alcoholics Anonymous is virtually ignored, but you can look it up. And he's the one that pointed the way the Oxford group to Roland Hazard. He also did something called moral inventory with him too. So this is very interesting. And so Bill started taking people through a 5-step process once Ebby brought the bill, right? So Hazard brought it to Ebby brought it to Bill. And Bill failed with his first 6 prospects. He goes to Silkworth and says, what am I doing wrong? And he goes, well, you're hitting up with God first. You're telling them, they got to find God. He got him to hardcore medical facts of powerlessness, allergy, obsession. And he remembered what he had told him, and he brought it. He put the first step was born, and put on top of those 5 steps. And he kind of like mangled them a little bit and reworded them a little bit. The first person he brought to was Dr. Bob, who said, he said he's got 5 minutes to turn into 5 hours because he brought him that allergy obsession. And Bob got sober, took him about a month, but he got sober on June 10th, 1935, founding day of Alcoholics Anonymous. And within 2 years of that founding date, they had about 40 members. And that era was called the flying blind period. No big book. They had a 6-step program that varied from place to place. I'm going to put it up on the screen really quick. Now, this is just one that Bill scribbled out. It's not necessarily the sick because they're different everywhere. The same idea, just slightly worded different. So we admitted that we were licked, old school word there for defeated, that we were powerless over alcohol. We made a moral inventory of our defects or sins. We confessed and shared our shortcomings with another person in confidence. So you got one, two, three, four, and I mean, I'm sorry, you got step one in there. Of course, you got step four, you got step five, and made amends to all the people we harmed. You got 8 and 9, and then we try to carry to help alcoholics 12, and then pray for whatever God there was. Now some of those flip-flopped around a little bit, like the last, the last ones there and stuff. But that was one when an interview Bill did, and he kind of wrote down what he had saw. And so they're just trying to figure out this whole thing. But these guys have tried so many different ways, excuse me, to be sober, right? And they've been incarcerated, they've been in jail, they've been in inebriate asylums, they've been all over the place. And all of a sudden, this guy, Bill Wilson, takes them through a variation of the Oxford group steps. Some of the guys who were struggling out of the Oxford group, all of a sudden, they're all sober, right? And there's 40 of them, and they want to figure out the stuff that happened to them. And all of them were brand new to this thing, and they're on fire. And so a big part of their daily routine was morning and evening quiet time, meditation, prayer, journalizing, right? And it varied amongst each member as far as they long they did it, whatever. But during that time they studied books, and of course some studied the Bible, but the members really wanted to go deeper than that and study philosophy. And they really wanted to know and understand what was happening to them. They were big into studying and gaining more understanding of things like faith and knowing and believing and consciousness and meditation, prayer, confession, God's will, forgiveness, amends, all those words they want to know deeper. Other, words like courage and calmness and patience, honesty, love, healing. They want to know all what that meant. And they also wanted to study words like resentment and anger and fear and social dishonesty, guilt. And the books they read were roadmaps to the teachings of that stuff. So a better understanding of that stuff. So they could understand such things as spiritual conversion and consciousness deeper. But they're also interested in the teaching in teaching these, things to others. So they study this stuff so they could turn it over to other people and work with others. You know, um, so these books I'm going to show you up here were a big influence. And before, one thing I want to mention is at this time, the 20s and 30s, the metaphysics movement was huge. I mean, Emmett Fox spoke in front of 8,000 people in New York City. That was crazy back then for that to happen. So metaphysics is the study of reality and existence. It's the truth of who we are, why we are here, and what's our purpose. So it's basically philosophical science, and it's the study of being, knowing, and conscious. That's what it put it. But it was explained using logic and reason. So it's a totally different approach than we've heard before. You don't have to be, Emmett Fox's book is broken down the Beatitudes from the Bible, but he does it from a standpoint no one ever heard before. But if one member could grasp it deeper, then it could explain it to another member who couldn't grasp it as easy. And even though AA had religious members, they had atheists, agnostics, and those who were in the middle, they all agreed on metaphysics. And these guys were reading so many different books that every day when they would see each other, some guy would go, "Oh, just check this out. Here's what I learned last night." You know how we did it when we first got here. We discovered more stuff. But those different spins started separating them from the Oxford group in a good way. And all these books are metaphysics, but it's the same stratosphere, so to speak. I'm going to share the screen. And we're going to look at these books. So I come up with 15. It used to be it used to be 10. Now it's grown. But the first book on the list is The Varieties of Religious Experiences by William James. And that came out in 1902. You can see all these groups came out around the time, of that, the 30s or even a little further back. And it was read really close by Bill Wilson after a spiritual experience. Hold on one second. I gotta yell at my kid. back to our regular scheduled program. My son was on his VR and it makes my screen my internet signal go down. So I had to tell him really quick. He knows better. But anyways, Variety of Religious Experiences came out, and it's a book that Ebby brought to Bill after his spiritual experience to gain a deeper understanding. It's also a foundation for Bill's first step theory, of how deflation was, led to awakening or experience. It explains the difference between awakening and experience, which Bill read both but didn't really grasp it right away. Other members explained it to him. So that book is big. The next one is Modern Man in Search of a Soul by Dr. Carl Jung, 1933. It's a perfect introduction to new philosophical ideas and concepts for this new society because it covers man's need to have an awakening, how emotions and influences a person's attitude. It's a really hard read, but it's a good book. And how negative attitude can change through awareness and create negative emotions, like targeting self-esteem as high or low, awareness of, changes a person's attitude type stuff. And, psychic change. And he believed in order to overcome self-centeredness, a spiritual conversion is necessary, who he explains in that book. The next one is Sermon on the Mount. It's a guy that's mentioned, Emmett Fox. This was set forth the basic principles of what was called the New Thought philosophy and metaphysics. That was a big thing when A came out, you have something called the New Thought philosophy, and that's what really helped us go. And stuff but his is pretty deep because like God is the only power. That man is God. Man's a child of God. God is perfect and good, forgiving others, scientific prayer, which is, praying and taking action, daily meditation, um, consciousness and deeper spiritual development. And God will always heal type of stuff. There's a couple of books by Fox I want to mention. And that the first one is called Find and Use the Inner Power, Your Inner Power. And the next one is Power Through Constructive Thinking and The Great Adventure. So I'll mention those again. Find and use your inner power, power through constructive thinking, and The Great Adventure. And one more is Alter Your Life. I just almost forgot that one. Those are all good books by him. These guys read this guy's closely. And A Man Thinketh by James Allen, and that's 1903. So a little bit of an older book, like William James time, but it's a James Allen's amazing. And it's about the power of thought, the underlying premise of a noble thoughts create a noble person, a moral person create a moral person, right? I mean, moral thoughts create a moral person, and bad thoughts make a miserable person. That's the type of thing he does. But we are what we think is what the book's about. And he focuses really on fear. And he says stuff in there like the worst kind of fear is fear of fear. And he talks about having a calm, serene mind, shuts out the weaker mind type stuff. It's very deep stuff. Number 5 is A Common Sense of Drinking, 1933, Richard Peabody. You mentioned this a few weeks ago, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but huge influence on Alcoholics Anonymous, big. And he was the first to use medical terms like alcoholic and alcoholism, but he used italic writing. He used terms like powerlessness, malady, spree, manifestation, maladjusted alive, root of our problem, drink like a gentleman, recover, words like that. Once alcoholic, always alcoholic. Half measures of ale is nothing. Real alcoholic, hard drinker, stuff like that. Just a man of 30s and his thing. The next one is the writings of Samuel Shoemaker, and this stuff he did from 1920 to 1945. Huge influence. Some of those books are like they're short little pocket books. You can't find them anywhere. I mean, you can probably find them some and download somewhere, but National Awakening, Religion That Works, Confident Faith, How to Find God, If I Lift You Up is one you can find. First Century Christian Fellowship, which eventually became an Oxford group. Those books were really about how to find God through action and also what to do when you have God. God can manage me, I cannot manage myself type stuff. And then the one he had in there, one of his books talked a lot about the decision to cast our will and life to God. Sound familiar? God taking care of our needs. So all these words, these guys are just taking us in. And then what is the Oxford Group? Unknown writer, 1933. So soul surgery, which is one I'll mention next, outlines the Oxford Group methods. What is the Oxford Group? Explains the group's full range of practices, absolutes, surrender, restitution, guidance. It doesn't really get into it. But the next one, soul surgery by Howard Walter in 1921. This one was they revised them a little bit so they would fit more together because the group really took off. But this was a really deep outline of the Oxford Group program, the first real Oxford, first book they did, and this book had deaths and practices and basically directions book like the Big Book. It was a big influence on it. For Sinners Only by Arthur J. Russell, best known as the Oxford Group Bible. This, book tells the story of the Oxford Group's movement, how it started, Frank Buckman and everything like that. But he gets into practices of, I'm going to paraphrase it. I think it's called the 9 ingredients of love. And it's like patience, kindness, humility, unselfishness, good temperament, and all stuff like that. I forget them all, but this is a really good book. Someone lent me that book a long time ago and I read it. But the next guy we'll see, he's a huge influence on AA named Glenn C. And the book is called The Upper Room. And it's just a daily devotional book, but Glenn C., they liked him because he was simple and he wasn't overly, dogmatic and Christian, evangelical. So the next one was Ann Smith's journal. And Bill Wilson called her the mother of AA and considered her a founder. And she assembled her journals from 33 to 39, and she was big into daily devotion. And her journal had directions for Oxford Group stuff, in spiritual terms that they could grasp. She would like reinterpret it for them. And she really spearheaded a spiritual program. She could really describe the spiritual ideas that we see. And she was, when Bill expanded the 6 steps and the 12, a lot of the wordings we see are very from that journal. 12 was the medical journals of William Duncan Silkworth. And that's from 1931 to 40. You can actually find these, and I'll put it in the chat on silkworth.net. I have a direct link to these. But like Manifestation of an Allergy, from his medical journal was written in 1931, well before the Big Book even was a thought. And let me see if I can put it in the chat right now. Oh, there it goes. Technology there. So you can download those, and it's interesting to read. Some were written afterwards, but they read this stuff very close. And if it wasn't for these journals, they would never even consider him for doctor's opinion. The Higher Powers of Mind, Body, and Spirit by Ralph Waldo Trine. Trine was huge. This is 1917. He was a philosopher and the leader of the New Thought movement, one of the leaders in the New Thought movement, and contributed to spiritual words, a language like higher power, fourth dimension of existence, spirituality, power greater than yourself, stuff like that, and other metaphysical terms. Another one of his books that they read was With the Infinite, and that was a really old one, like 1890. And there's lots of short books he had. The next one is a very interesting group because it's a set of writings and they're pamphlets called The Writings of the Young People's Society of Christian Endeavor. Some people just call them the Society of the Christian Endeavor, but that's their Young People's Society. And their books were no one knew who they were from when they started, 1886 to 1907. Not a lot of people knew who they were in one state. But when metaphysics took off, people started grabbing their books like 20 years later. And they thought to find substance and practices, how to read scripture, the scientific prayer again, principles in service, seeking God's guidance through quiet time, through meditation. And the last one is Glenn C. again. Glenn Clark, his name is. I will lift up mine eyes. And closely read by Bill Wilson. And this was basically required readings of these first guys. And Um, discussions of power and transformation of life. Discussions of profound difference between worshiping God and knowing God, which is different stuff back then, but they really liked them. I'm going to mention a couple other books um, that aren't on this list. The Runner's Bible was really popular. That was by Nora Smith Holm, 1913. The next one is The Greatest Thing in the World by Henry Drummond. That's really old one, 1880. But Bill talked about that in one of his interviews I heard. For Sinners Only, that's Arthur J. Russell. It's in the Oxford Group. Religion and Medicine, and that's The Moral Teachings of the Nervous Disorders by Elwood Worcester, and that's a Emmanuel Movement guy. Read it really close. He was one of the first outside people in like 1936. They brought him in just to speak. They would sink these guys in, and I Will Lift Up My Mind's Eye. I think I mentioned that one already. Yeah. So I'm going to close this out. I will post this in our WhatsApp group, and I put the link to that. You can find all this stuff I put up. So let's talk about this. It might go a little bit over tonight because there's a lot of information, but that's good. In the fall of 37, they're reading all these books, and Bill and Bob, when I mentioned they have 40 members. So they're at a gathering. I believe it was a Christmas party in December. And their word of mouth recovery program consisting of 6 steps had really, grown. And they're like looking around the room going, we got something big's going on here. And it was then that Bill completely gave up the idea of returning to it. He was thinking about restarting his business and making just like a side project, flip-flopped around. He only used his business, never went back to his business. He still did stock, but he never stopped his own business again. He had a dream and he gave up on it for Alcoholics Anonymous, which was his real dream. And he worked full-time in AA. So in the spring of 38, there were 2 meetings, New York and Akron. And Bill always thought bigger. So he began to focus on the idea to bring the future, it's not called Alcoholics Anonymous yet, to other states. And so what they came up with was the idea was for a speaking tour, but there was no money. They wanted to caravan across the United States, but no money to do that. So they came up with a new project, and the project was coded Book of Experience. And it could be a book to describe how to get sober and stay sober. It wasn't ever meant to be a sponsorship book. It was just meant for you to read in another state. If I send it to Canada and Rob's never won in Canada, you can have an experience. But so Bill and the rest of these guys, they thought really big. They thought big, and they had no doubt what they were creating is going to be groundbreaking, and it would change the world. There was no doubt in their minds. There was no failure. And the problem, though, money. So Charles B. Towns, he's the owner of Towns Hospital where Silkworth worked, and very prominent man, very rich. And he was very impressed with what Bill had done. All of a sudden, no one ever came through his treatment center and turned around, stayed sober, and came back and helped people and got them to come back. So his eyes are open. So he offered Bill a job. When Bill went to hit money up to him, he goes, "Oh, I got better at me. I'm going to give you a job." And he offered him to run the hospital, and that Silkworth would be medical director, and he would be like the recovery director. And he could live there, and he could do all his work. And Bill brought this up to the group about the job offer. One of the members stood up and said, I don't remember who it was, but said, it really changed, it set course, whether he says, Bill, you got to realize we can never be professional. This can never be a business. So he went back and turned Towns down, and with Silkworth's help, Towns gave a loan of $2,500. That's $42,000 today. Then they were offered good money by a publishing company, big money for that time. and upfront money, but they didn't really, there was a lot of loopholes in it. Everyone was like, let's do it, except for Bill and Hank Parkhurst. Now Hank is a businessman, Bill's a stockbroker, and they knew how to hustle. And so Bill and Hank formed Works Publishing Company, and they sold 600 shares of Works Publishing Company at $25 per share. It's about $325 a day, if it was worth. The money from the sales would, be used to pay off expenses, enable Bill and Ruth Hawk, who's the person that typed up the big book with Bill, the secretary, to continue to do the work. Then they went to Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, and they wanted him to donate $50,000, $650,000 today. He declined, said that much money would spoil things, and he contributed $5,000 and $30 weekly payments. That's about $65,000 today. And the reason he turned them down is more than just spoiling them. The Rockefellers were prominent, right, in America. They had good Rockefellers and they had bad Rockefellers. And the stigma was that the Rockefellers ran the country, owned the country, ran the country. And John D. was known as a good Rockefeller. But he knew the stigma the Rockefeller name could bring, and he did not want this new group to be brought down by the Rockefellers or be called the Rockefeller movement. And he also had fears that Rockefeller members could buy him out or hold it over their head. So he just secretly paid him. And they started writing the book on March of 1938. Bill is a principal writer. He edited and rewrote the manuscripts at his home on legal paths and dictated them to his secretary, Ruth. He's like I said, principal writer. Here's the thing. There's one problem. It's not a problem, though. He never written a book. Bill got sober in December 11th, 1934. The big book was released on June 10th of 39. He began writing in May of 38. He had 3 years, a little over 3 years sober when the book was written. The way time is looked at nowadays, just let that sink in for a second. 3 years sober and he's writing this thing. What would AA members today do if some guy wanted to write a book on AA? He got 3 years. They say, sit down until you got some time, But know this, when Bill was writing the book, he was on fire. I mean, God's flowing through this guy's veins, very guided. He's a visionary. Because he's spiritually awoke. Spiritually awake people have visions all the time. And he saw no failure, like I said before. He knew everything in this book needed to connect to the real alcoholic. Everything. The other members that helped with the book were also on fire. These aren't all of them, but Hank Parker said, listen to the time these guys had. Hank Parker's 2 years. Fitz Mayo, 2 years. Phil Smith, 2 years. Jim Borwell, perhaps the biggest influence from the crowd on this book, had 5 months. 5 months. 5 months. Others contributed had just a few months also. Let that sink in for a second. If it was written today, none of these guys would be allowed in the room. Let's just let that sink in. And all these guys are on fire. But the book consists of 2 separate sections, an outline of the program and a collection of individual recovery stories put together and edited by a sober newspaper reporter who would actually coin the name Alcoholics Anonymous. I forget his name, but the first half of the book required much more work. And 3 main sources, Bill used was the Oxford Group, Sam Shoemaker, Dr. Silkworth, Carl Jung, William James, and Richard Peabody, the style Richard Peabody used. And when Bill started to lay out the big book, he gathered members together and he would read the contents in there and route back discussion, led to debates and arguments, especially when we discussed spiritual, like we agnostics. It spent 6 months on that, arguing over it. Bill knew the book had to appeal to every single type of person, the atheist, the religious member, like I said, the alcoholic. But he wanted everyone to have a voice. So he broke it down into 3 committees. He divided everyone into 3 committees. And the first committee was called the Conservatives. It's a faction of evangelical Christian members. In other words, the the more aggressive members from a religious standpoint. This is led by Fitzmail, and he was a hardcore G member and an Episcopal minister's son, and the second to recover at Towns Hospital. And Fitz, he insisted the book must express Christian biblical terms and Christian doctrines and values and have Bible references and expressions. A lot of those did make the big book, but they were reworded. But he also emphasized it must be focused on the teachings of the Oxford group, and you must put it in the bottom of the page and all this. And lots of these guys in this committee were in and out of the Oxford group for years, and they strongly believed the program should not be open to unbelievers, which is why Rowan never joined AA. Oxford group requirement was you had to be a believer, right? And that's why Rowan didn't join AA, because he didn't believe in the aspect of you choose your own God, all this stuff. So the second committee was called the Liberals, and this was the largest of the three groups. It was big, and these were the more spiritual, feels like the Bill Wilson kind of guys. So, you know, the spiritual members, and not as much religious. A mixture of, you know, spiritual and religious members, but really laid back, less aggressive, less combative, calm. And they were the voice of reason, and they really got people to listen because they're like the science guys, and they were more on the ways of Bill, and they had no objection against the word God, but no overuse of the word, and sparingly, and fearing too much God would scare people away. And they were dead set, 100% dead set against Christian doctrine in biblical terms. And spiritual, yes. Christian, no. These guys balance, like, help Bill balance these other two groups. And interesting, not many of the members of this group were OG members, Oxford group members. And one thing Bill did with the Oxford group is he would sneak people in there. He didn't care if they were Christian or not. He would just get them to do the tenets. And a lot of those guys are from that group. So the third committee was called the Radicals. This is the former agnostic members and atheist members. And remember, the atheist is the person that rejects all ideas of God, and the agnostic is just a skeptic. He's not sure, he wants proof. He thinks something might be there, but but these guys had a rep being very outspoken, argumentative, cocky, egotistical, and aggressive. Sorry. Um, very argumentative and aggressive. The committee was led by Jim Burwell, who's an atheist. Hold on one second. I gotta send a text. All sorts of distractions tonight. Um, so the committee was led by Jim Burwell, and he's an atheist, and he's known for being very aggressive and argumentative, but was also looked up as perhaps the smartest guy in the entire room. Very smart. Um, Jim, the contributions he brought to Alcoholics Anonymous were second only to Bill and Dr. Bob. For instance, when early A members, OG members, Oxford Group members he would hear, like he heard a guy one time say, hey, guy, come in here. All you need for membership is to believe in God. He said, no, all you need is a desire to stop drinking. That's off the top of his head. That's how smart he was. And that's where we got Tradition 3. And that drove more Oxford Group members out of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he didn't care. But the title, chapter 4, We Agnostics, came from Burwell. The original draft of step 2 says, came to believe God could restore sanity. Burwell stepped in and said, just tone it down, power greater than ourselves. Let's ease into God. And we don't want God 2 times in a row. He was the one that really helped build the synonymous words, shift it up, make it different. And Bill later said those expressions were lifesavers to the AA. But you would hear more about Burwell as I go through this group, and I explain, later on when we get to how it works, I can explain like how he helped Bill with the steps. And but this group, it had another leader, and the second leader was Bill's right-hand man, and it was Hank Parkhurst, and he was Bill's first New York sponsee, a former agnostic. He believed now like in universal power. Um, Parkhurst is perhaps the most forgotten man in history. In Dawkins' opinion, he's the one. He's a psychopath that Sokrat describes, the man that he saw and he could barely recognize him years later, right when he saw him again. He's also the unbeliever in the story in the back of the book. Hank was the wizard behind the curtain, right? He also had a significant role in the development of the big book. He was Bill's, like I said, right-hand man writing the book, and he played an extensive role as an editor of texts and the stories. He wrote to the employers as well. Bill even said, without Hank and his hard driving and aggressiveness to raise money and promoting and keep me on track, he said, the book would never have gotten written. No Hank, no big, no Hank, no big book. And Ruth said if it wasn't for Bill Wilson, the big book never got written. And Ruth also said if it wasn't for Hank, it would never got published. He's a smart, smooth talker, good salesman, very outspoken, very transparent with Bill. He wrote Bill a letter right before they go into the publishing. And because he always asked for feedback, but he was ignoring Hank. Bill got kind of tired of Hank by this time and was ignoring him. He sent him a letter. And he said, Bill, here's these. He goes, you have to make these changes. If you don't, I will form a committee and I will make them for you. And we will make them for you. The changes were two changes. They had guys who understood them after step 3 and step 11. That came from Burwell. It wasn't Hank Bill was ignoring, he was ignoring Burwell because they were dragging this production of the book, but they were going to, step over Bill, and Bill's like, oh, wait a minute. The only reason Hank is a forgotten member is because in September of 39, just months after the big book came out, he started drinking again. He would never enjoy ever long-term sobriety and died a miserable drunk on the streets, without a penny. He tried to sue AA a few times, and there's a whole other story with that. But the radicals were totally against religious ideas and that type of tone and direction, saying that an alcoholic would never buy into it, believing that a psychological book was the way to go. They wanted God deleted from the book entirely. Of course, the liberal ones, said, hey, wait a minute, they spoke for Bill. Bill did not necessarily like these guys a whole lot. He didn't agree with these guys a whole lot, but listened to them. But the words like power and spiritual nature, sunlight of spirit came from these guys. Matter of fact, the words that refer to God that are different words come from these guys. And Bill would say the greatest contribution of the book came from the atheist agnostics. He didn't realize that till way later, but they had widened the gateway because he didn't see it until people started doing the steps. And he said, well, wait a minute, these guys really help us, and it really widened the gateway for people to come through, regardless of how they believed or didn't believe. So every Tuesday, the committees would meet and they would gather at Bill's home, and he would read what he had written the past week, and they would start arguing over it. And after, it would get loud. It's like the stock market. And why 12 steps? Why on our knees? You got too much God. They would just, who wants to, character defects? Why inventory? More people disagree about the inventory than agreed upon it. But Bill went back down. Well, I'll get into that when we get to how it works. But debates went on for months. And Bill said he felt more like an umpire than an author. And many times he wanted to throw the book out the window and quit. But Bill was a salesman, and he knew how to present the stuff to these people. And he had a way to calm the groups down in minutes and get them to listen to him. He would explain to them the importance of every word. And at the end of the day, they trusted him because they all knew that there was something special about Bill. They knew he was more than just a talented writer. He was this, like I said, a visionary. They knew he was something more going on in him than the average person. The big book was limited to 400 pages. The problem was they had to edit out 400 pages. They had 800 pages. 800. So what did they edit out? You know, they had planned to put 40 stories in the back of the book. That was brought down to 28 and shortened to 16, and the length was shorter of the stories. But the big question is what was edited out of the first 164 pages? Bill's story was originally 38 pages long. Edited down. Well, it wasn't edited down to 16. Bill rewrote it. You can find the original version if you look up online. The original version of Bill's story is quite different. But there are rumors that 2 or 3 more chapters might have been removed. Some have stated there was deeper emphasis on 6 and 7. Now, this was a big rumor for a while that I believe is true because Passon mentions it about the stuff being edited out. Didn't say what it was. And when I visited A World Service, I sat with an archivist for 45 minutes and he confirmed it was true. And he said, from what he heard, How It Works was going to be close to 100 pages long. Something crazy like that. And that led to speculation of what would they edit out. The archivist told me that what he heard was it was a broader Deep Enough 4, maybe an explanation of a harm inventory, perhaps deeper on fear, um, and so forth. This is the craziest part of that 400 pages they took out. Well, when they had the New York office where the original drafts were stored in barrels, right? And they moved to a larger office down the street. Rather than move these big barrels, they just threw them in the garbage. So no one will ever know what's on those edited out pages. So the title of the book evolved from Book of Experience to 100 Men, then to A Way Out. And the reason they got rid of 100 Men is kind of before its time, because usually when they said men in those days, it meant everybody. But one of the members said, it was a male that said it, if we call ourselves 100 men, then they're going to think we're just a male movement. And 30 years from now, they might not look at it like that. Well, that's ahead of their time. Then it also was The Way Out. We could have been the Way Outs. Then they wanted the Wilson movement, and the final choice was Alcoholics Anonymous. And that came from that sports writer, also came from Dr. Bob. In the spring of 38, Bill wrote to Dr. Bob suggesting, other way around. Dr. Bob wrote to Bill suggesting that the title of the book, Alcoholics Anonymous, and suggested to use the same name for the fellowship. Before Bill brought to Ruth, he would bring it to the committee to make changes. So they would have what's the original manuscript, and it's the edited original draft. You can find the book called The Book That Created It All. I was going to put it up on the screen, but I forgot. But it's like it shows pictures of the Ruth Hawk's typings and all the scribbles of all these guys. It's so amazing. There's everything in there. But the guy who sells that book bought the original manuscript in a folder, spiral back binder, for $2.5 million. So in 1939, they had the big book cleaned up enough to bring it to the publisher. And the publication date was April 1st. Sorry. The publication was April 1st, but it was printed at Cornwell Press in Cornwell, New York on April 4th, 1939. 4,730 copies were made, which is unheard of they didn't have anything. Everyone thought they were crazy. Again, Hank and Bill, right? The first 10 copies were delivered April 10th that year to the Newark office, and the Hank and Bill shared. And the price was $3.50. Very expensive at the time. That would be $60 today. It had no fanfare whatsoever. It did not sell. It was a bomb. Hank sent 20,000 direct mail announcements to psychiatrists and doctors and produced 2 orders. Think that for a minute. 20,000. 2 orders. but reviews of the medical from like the Journal of American Medicine called the book organized propaganda. Journals of nervous and I think it was medical disease, something like that, called it religious extortion with a bunch of rambling. So nearly all 4,700 copies sat in the warehouse of Works Publishing for quite a while. They were nearly bankrupt, but then in 1941, 2 years into this, or 2 years of setting out, in 1941, things changed when Saturday Evening Post, Jack Alexander, I believe his name was, posted a very positive article about the big book. And then came the New York Times article stating that the book was the thesis of the book had more sound-based and psychologically than any of the book ever been written. Green Magazine, which is a prominent book at the time in New York, published an article calling the book the greatest liberating force of the 20th century. Another review said there was hope because there was finally something for former alcoholics and alcoholics. Another critic called it extraordinary. All this gained attention. A started receiving inquiries. People started knocking at their doors. It took 2 years to sell all those copies of the first printing, but they did it. So the first edition big book had 50,000 copies worldwide. And that's from 39 to 55. And then I'm sorry, I said it wrong. The big book total is 50 million copies has been sold, but from 39 to 55, first edition sold 300,000, second edition 1.1 million, second edition, third edition 76 to 2002 were 19 million, almost 20 million copies. And from 2002 to now, the fourth edition has done about 50 million. That's crazy. My friend always says, where's the 50 million members though? Because it's A is a revolving door. But then in 2010, Time Magazine placed the big book on its list of the most influential books ever written. The Library of Congress designated as one of the 88 books that shaped America. It has been translated into 43 languages. First edition printings today can be sold for as much as $400,000. The only things that have changed in the book are in the first 4 pages. I mean, everything's pretty much the same, slight changes. The biggest change happened in the second printing. Members came at the bill and said, hey, we're not having these burning bush experiences like you had. We're having what William James called the spiritual awakening slowly over a period of time. So they changed step 12 to having had a spiritual experience, having a spiritual awakening, and they added a spiritual penance to the back of the book. Other small changes were like ex-alcoholic to ex-problem drinker and non-drinker. When the second edition came out in 1955, they renumbered the big book, and Bill's story, Doctor's Opinion was on page 1, and Bill's story was pushed to page 1. They pushed Silkworth into the Roman numerals, and someone was asked, well, with Schmitty, who is Dr. Bow's son, when I first got sober, I got to meet him at a conference, and he was pretty old, but he said that was all Bill. Bill wanted to be on page 1. So he just said, sorry, Silkworth, and pushed in the Roman numerals because Dr. Opinion was on page 1. And also, Bill was the only one that wanted his book at his story at the beginning. They wanted to put Bill at the end of the book, like the other guys. The new forwards come out each time. They make the appropriate changes for the growth, hundreds to thousands to millions. The U.S. copyright of the big book first edition expired in 1967. This is kind of funny. So 1983, the second edition expired and they re-upped it, but then they realized they re-upped it before it expired. And they said, hey, did you guys realize we never re-upped the copyright of the first edition? So basically, the big book is public domain. And what that means is anyone can do a big book. Uh, like I have this book, and it's the study edition. It has the big book with like where you can put, you know, your own notes inside of it to a blank page. Very cool stuff. Like looks like that. So anyone could take a big book. I mean, Frank in here could take write Frank's big book and have notes and stuff in there. And the reason that was is um it's this public domain means it's to anybody. You can go on Amazon and look up public domain books and there it is, you know. Um, but why is it nicknamed the Big Book is the question. And I don't have my reprint in front of me, but it's really thick, right? And the reason is the use of a new customary style of pages was to make them thin so that they don't go like this and real thick. And but that was way expensive. So they went to older style, thicker pages where the pages kind of, went jagged with each other. And they saved a lot of money doing that. And Hank sold the idea to Bill that thicker pages would convince the alcoholic that they get their money's worth, right? So the members called it the Big Book. And it's only mentioned once in the Big Book in Florida second edition. People are drawn to our book because the vast importance has saved so many lives. You know, you think about it. It helped save my life. I have passion for it. When they made this book, they broke the mold. You know, I mean, it's the most perfect book I've ever read. There's not much like it. You can't find anything like it. You know, there's an episode of Star Trek where I don't know if you guys remember where they they find the planet and everyone's following Chicago, like the old Chicago in the 30s. Everyone's dressed up as gangsters. And what it was is these guys brought a book to this planet of the Chicago way and they read it and they turned into that. And my friend, grand sponsor, used to joke, he said, maybe one day, a few thousand years from now, they'll dig up the big book out of a crate and people will make that the only book we need. It's pretty, makes a lot of sense. So next week, we're going to, guess what? We're going to open the book. And, go from there. I'm going to stop recording.